So let's start by setting our motivation. So again, we recollect our understanding of the Buddha as an unmistaken guide and his wisdom as a reliable, unfailable, repeatable path. So in that sense, we generate a mind of confidence in the material. And then we think of the purpose of the goal. The purpose of achieving enlightenment is to be of ultimate benefit to sentient beings, not simply to put an end to our own suffering, but to lead all sentient beings out of suffering. So these minds of refuge and bodhicitta, you try to cultivate. All right. So with that motivation, we will turn back to the text. So as we've said, we are moving into now the second major topic of the Lamrim Year, the section on precious human rebirth or perfect human rebirth. So even just there in the English translation of the title is interesting. I've always found it interesting because those are very different in English. Those are very different words, precious and perfect. They have very different meanings, and yet you'll find that one of those phrases being used to refer to the whole topic in the Lamrim. Different, Lamrim texts will use one or the other. It's never like precious and perfect human rebirth. It's always perfect human rebirth or precious human rebirth. And so I don't know. I wonder if the Tibetan word maybe carries both meanings, or the Tibetan phrase or the Sanskrit phrase, because you often find other languages being more nuanced like that. And there's oftentimes not a great English word that gets at a sort of a dual meaning. So I wonder if that's why some translators prefer one or the other, is because they're in a situation where the original carries both at the same time, and we can't really do that in English very well. But we'll get into the fact that both of those words do characterize this topic as a whole in different ways. That it is, in a way, it is true that the topic is telling us that the kind of life that we have is both perfect and precious, but for different reasons. So we'll look at that. So the first contemplation of this topic is kind of another one of those advertisements that we talked about, where we are convincing ourselves of why we're studying this topic. What is the point? What is the advantage of engaging in study on this topic. And then the next section, the next several contemplations, some of which we will get to today, and some of which we will get to on Monday. The next several are on the disadvantages of the other states of rebirth that are open to us, that we could be experiencing and that we have experienced beginninglessly, but that we are not presently experiencing. So in a way, we'll start looking at this topic as it's understood, these 18 different qualities that characterize a precious, perfect human rebirth. And they're divided into what are called the freedoms and the richnesses, or sometimes called the freedoms and the endowments. I don't know if both, I know that initially richnesses is used in Lamrim Year. I don't know if that's consistent, or if endowments is also going to creep in other days. But so the freedoms are negative things that we have experienced and could be experiencing and may yet experience in future lives, but are not presently experiencing. And the richnesses are beneficial, positive things that we are in fact experiencing at the moment, in the context of this lifetime. And if all of these 18 factors are complete, if they come together in total within a single human lifetime, then that is a perfect or precious human rebirth, one that's qualified by all of these 18. And a number of them, not all of them, but a number of them are kind of default, so things that we have by default, and that's in a way what we'll be looking at, because we simply are human. That's not that's a sort of a necessary but insufficient condition, because again, it's not called precious human. It's not called precious rebirth. It's called precious human rebirth. So that is a necessary. So, which is interesting, because of all of the places that we could take rebirth, only the human realm applies to perfect or precious. There isn't also perfect and precious God realm rebirth, or perfect and precious, animal realm. It's, you have to have taken rebirth or be experiencing a rebirth in the human realm to have a perfect and precious rebirth of any kind. So the second series of contemplations are on these other possibilities that are not characterizing our experiences, and the disadvantages of that kind of experience when it does arise. So in a way, that's the first major thing that we will look at are the freedoms, then, in that sense. And then you could say, when we get to the richnesses, what we'll see then too is that some of the richnesses are really just the flip side of, and in that case, all of the flip side is, because the first series of freedoms that we're going to be looking at are the other realms, then the flip side is human realm, that is just applicable to all of these, which is technically, so really both of those are just one of the freedoms and one of the richnesses. It's just kind of lumped together, and so we're going to go into more detail. Yeah. So, any thoughts or questions so far? Okay. But we'll start then, before we get into those freedoms, we'll start with day 64, where again, it's sort of this advertisement for studying precious human rebirth. Lama Zopa says, an appreciation of the perfect human rebirth is fundamental to our Dharma journey. So we've said, it's come up in previous contemplations, and we've said that all of the Lamrim topics, they are presenting us with spiritual antidotes or spiritual solutions to obstacles that we face on the path to enlightenment. They are giving us tools to overcome obstacles that are preventing us from achieving enlightenment. And the first, we've covered proper relation to the spiritual guide, and that all of those tools, those techniques, that wisdom is helping us to not waste that opportunity, to not waste that relationship, to get the most benefit out of a personal relationship with a guru, rather than doing that incorrectly or not getting the full benefit. It's helping us to extract the essence of that way of relating. So we need to study that ideally before committing to that kind of interaction, so that we, from the get-go, do that as well as possible. And this, the second topic of the Lamrim, Precious Human Rebirth, is helping us to overcome the default view that we may have of looking at the world and seeing 8 billion humans and thinking that it must be common, it must be easy, it must be, you know, nothing special, nothing unique about that, that we are in possession of that, and therefore not really being motivated to again extract the essence, to get the most out of what we possess, because it just seems to us to be so ordinary, so common, that we just take it for granted, and we're not really extracting the real meaning of what we possess. That's the antidote that is sorry. So yeah. Yeah. He says, Lama Zopa says, the meditations on perfect human rebirth come right at the beginning, just after relying on a spiritual teacher. We need to understand karma, and we need to have refuge, and to deepen our commitment, we need to understand impermanence and death. He's introducing the other topics of the small scope there, but he says none of that will happen if we squander this precious and unique opportunity that we now have, this one time only. So that idea of one time only, you find that in the foundation of all good qualities, and it can be a little bit intimidating, or a little bit depressing. If you read that in the foundation of all good qualities, where it says this is found only once, but then it says, and is difficult to find again. So, kind of even in the foundation of all good qualities, both of those statements can't literally be true. It can't be found only once and just be difficult to find again, because it only happens once, right? So in a way, it's not what they're getting at is for the causes and the conditions to come together, all of the 18 qualities to come together in one human lifetime. It is difficult. That's true, amassing all of those causes and conditions. But really, it's more difficult if it were to happen just kind of, like from a lower realm rebirth, or just, if it was to just sort of ripen um, spontaneously in a way. Once we're in possession of a precious human rebirth, then we really do have an opportunity to intentionally create the causes and the conditions for more perfect or precious human rebirths, a succession of human lifetimes that can come after this. So it could be, that we came from the lower realms just immediately before this, and we kind of, all of these causes and conditions coming together in that way is rare and difficult, and still intentionally amassing them, even with a perfect human rebirth, no one's saying that it's easy, but it's easier. It's not as difficult. So it's not literally true that like this truly is our one and only opportunity to to fully complete the path. Um, but all of these qualities coming together for one person in one rebirth all at the same time is quite a feat, Buddhism would say, of all of the permutations, um, because even a human rebirth is insufficient for a perfect human rebirth. A perfect human rebirth is a subset of human rebirth. So it is quite difficult to truly amass all of the necessary causes and conditions, but it's much easier when you're in the driver's seat of that process, and you have met the teachings, you're following the teachings, you're guarding karma, you're doing all of the things that do create those causes and conditions, rather than just kind of hoping that they come together from, say, a lower realm kind of rebirth. Any thoughts or questions? So he says, only those of us with this perfect human rebirth can become inner scientists and discover the true cause of happiness. He says we're unbelievably fortunate. We have the opportunity to study, meditate, and understand everything that the Buddha taught, from the simplest Lamrim topic to the most advanced. We have the opportunity to develop the altruistic heart, the attitude that wishes to be fully awakened to benefit others, and to understand the reality of things and events. There is nothing that we cannot understand with this perfect human rebirth. So again, that's kind of the good news about it, is that once we're in possession of it, then we can manage that process. We can intentionally, we can understand, we can learn what are the causes of a perfect human rebirth, the karmic causes, and then we can set about intentionally creating those karmic causes such that our next lifetime is also a perfect human rebirth, and the lifetime after that, and so on, up until, moving in this progression of lifetimes until enlightenment is achieved, just moving from one conducive circumstance to another, all the way to full enlightenment. It becomes much easier to do that once once that has happened for you. Any thoughts or questions? All right, so then we'll move into um, okay, so I guess the next one is kind of still just a further elaboration before we move into those the disadvantages of the other kinds of rebirth. At day 65, Lama Zopa says the only chance of practicing Dharma is having exactly the set of conditions that we have at this very moment. And then he talks about um, the way of studying precious human rebirth, that there's three sections to understanding it. The first is, as I mentioned, those 18 qualities, the understanding what characterizes a perfect human rebirth versus what is not a perfect human rebirth. So kind of memorizing those 18 qualities, meditating on them, studying them, recognizing, applying them to one's own life and recognizing that they do characterize our experience. And then the second section is uh, understanding the benefits of possessing that, again, which is what he was just saying. There's no other kind of rebirth that permits a person, because it's true that in this topic, um, rebirth in like the Pure Lands is not addressed. It's not what they address are the other kinds of ordinary rebirths, the rebirths that are open to a person just under kind of normal karmic causes and conditions. So within that, there's no other, because there are advantages to um, rebirth in the Pure Lands, whereas there are no advantages to rebirths even in the what are called the upper realms of ordinary cyclic existence, which are the desire realm gods and then the form and formless realm gods. Even those kinds of experiences have no real spiritual benefit to them. Um, so, among all of the ordinary types of rebirth, it's only a perfect human rebirth where that sentient being is able to study and practice and meditate and achieve realizations. Because, again, like I say, some of that is possible in the Pure Lands, but it's just not addressed um, in, could be, and it could be that, I don't know if the Buddha taught Pure Lands in the Sutra path. He may have only taught Pure Lands in the Vajrayana path. So it could just be that they don't really mix the two sets of knowledge, because again, the Lamrim is the Sutra path. It's the public teachings of the Buddha, and not. I suspect that probably generally most of that was contained in the esoteric teachings, but. So then the first section is what is a perfect human rebirth. The second section are what are the advantages of a perfect human rebirth, and then the third section are the difficulty. I'm sorry, the difficulty of obtaining it. So again, the difficulty of actually causing all of those 18 qualities to simultaneously uh, manifest or to take root in one lifetime. Um, the story, I'm sure that I'm jumping ahead here. I'm sure the story is reflected in one of the days. But the historical, I mean, there's a few different ways that of or analogies that they give of that explain the difficulty. And again, this difficulty is mainly when you're not coming from a precious human rebirth where you've really cultivated it, that the difficulty mainly is sort of the simultaneously coming together of these qualities. But the way that they describe it is um, as if there was a blind. So that could be, and of course, like I say, it is still quite a challenge, even intentionally, to create the causes and conditions, but more so for it to just happen because there's a whole variety of karmic seeds that were kind of put into the mind in a whole variety of different lifetimes over an incredibly long period of time. And they're all kind of each ripening simultaneously, which could be how we got here to this, but may not necessarily be what we're up against in creating the causes and the conditions in the future. But the analogy, the historical analogy, is if it does ripen like that, in that more difficult way, then the analogy is to say that we are like a blind turtle, a sea turtle, swimming in the ocean. And um, so the idea would be that this turtle gets dropped off like in the Pacific Ocean, and then someone also drops uh, a golden ring that's just slightly larger than the circumference of the head of the blind turtle, and they drop that golden ring in the Indian Ocean. So it's gold, and it's metal, and so it's heavy, and so most of the time it is at the bottom of the ocean. Most of the time, because it's made out of metal, most of the time the gold ring is just laying on the bottom of the ocean. And it was dropped in, uh, let's say, the Indian Ocean. So the turtle's in the Pacific Ocean. This gold ring is dropped in the Indian Ocean, thousands of miles apart. And only sometimes does this golden ring get stirred up by, you know, wind and weather, and to have the kind of updraft that's sufficient to cause it to be kind of relatively on the surface of the ocean. um, and even if we say, even we could say it, maybe it floats, still, um, it's thousands of miles away, and this turtle only surfaces. It's a special turtle. It only needs to breathe. I don't know. I don't know if it's always the same number in all of the stories, but something like once every 100 years, once every 1,000 years, something like that. Again, by way of analogy. So you've got these two things happening in the ocean, and again, the turtle is blind, and the blind part is actually kind of important, because even if this ring is right next to the turtle is blind, and the turtle can't then adjust and move a couple of feet. Um, so that's why the turtle is blind. It's actually relevant to the probability of it happening. So they say that getting a perfect human rebirth, the odds of it are the same as the turtle surfacing and their head slipping into this golden ring. Um, and so, I mean, even if we say that the golden ring is always floating on the surface, still, you know, the odds of that are infinitesimally small. And they're using that just as an analogy for how likely it is that all of these qualities come together simultaneously to characterize one rebirth. That's sort of the historical, and there's probably others. And again, I'm sure that that story is mentioned here in a different day. But the third section is the difficulty of achieving a precious human rebirth, a perfect human rebirth. So you have to understand what it is, you have to understand the advantages of it, and then you have to understand how difficult it is to create the causes and the conditions for it to manifest. And that together is how you meditate and study on this topic, is by getting deeply familiar with all three of those aspects of a perfect human rebirth. Any questions? So then Lama Zopa gives us some practice advice, and he says a good way to meditate on the perfect human rebirth is to go over each of the 8 freedoms and 10 richnesses individually, reflecting on them, on each one in depth, trying to see just why we are so fortunate to have these 18 qualities. He says we shouldn't meditate on each of the freedoms and richnesses as if we were an observer. We must really put ourselves into the situation as if that were us and feel what it would be like. Then we can get an appreciation of the actual situation we're in at the moment. So that's kind of what he's going to then do. As I said, the next several contemplations are looking at each of these other realms kind of one by one by one. And, which is necessary to really get a strong sense. You could say, oh, well, yes, I wasn't born here, I wasn't born there. But unless you really understand what the beings of that realm are experiencing and why it's disadvantageous to be experiencing it, then you can't you don't really have a deep appreciation of it. You have to really understand exactly what is going on in that realm and why what is going on in that realm is problematic from a spiritual growth perspective. And then you see why the opposite is so useful, why having a perfect human rebirth is so particularly beneficial with respect to that aspect of it. And then he talks about how it also helps us to develop compassion, because, and this is, kind of another important aspect too, because we don't want this to feed into a sense of like our superiority. We don't, which, because we're kind of thinking about we're thinking about our own life, and we're thinking about, yes, I have this quality, yes, I have this quality, and it could, the ego, it's an ongoing concern that our ego can get involved in our spiritual practice, and it can kind of just inflate our sense of ourselves and think, oh, well, I must have been some extraordinary practitioner, and I've created all of these causes and conditions, how amazing am I. And then we can just kind of feel a sense of separateness and a sense of um, you know self-aggrandizement in a way. But what Lama Zopa is encouraging us to do is to use that to help us to develop our compassion, because we, for one, we haven't always had a perfect human rebirth. Two, a perfect human rebirth is something that you can gain and lose within a lifetime. So we may not always have it even for the rest of this lifetime. And three, it's true that there are other humans and other beings in other realms who don't have it and may not have it. I mean, of course, if they're in another realm, they, by definition, can't have it for the, you know, continuity of that lifetime. But but a human who doesn't have it presently, they could develop it in the future, even in 5 years or 10 years. Things could change, and they might it might characterize their experience. But still, to intentionally try to think about um, developing compassion for those sentient beings that are blocked from really tapping into their potential, that can't either temporarily, I mean, of course, it's temporary, all of it is ultimately temporary because that lifetime will end and a different lifetime will emerge, and it could be that their next lifetime is a perfect human rebirth. So it's all, it's all even, and even this, of course, what we do have, even if it persists until we die, it's still temporary because we will die. So we then have to create the causes and the conditions for another human rebirth, another perfect human rebirth. So in a way, thinking about that existential condition, and having compassion for the fleeting nature of that experience, and how uh, difficult it is for the beings who are blocked. How, so it isn't just trying to think that, oh, I have this amazing thing, but also um, not all sentient beings do. And then I should try to make prayers that that my merit ripens to create that for them, and so on, so that we are fueling our spiritual growth and development and not fueling the ego mind that's just sort of feeling superior and separate from all of the other sentient beings who may not possess a perfect human rebirth now, or you know um, yeah.
Yeah, may I ask a question,
Yep.
Is it saying that all these conditions are necessary in order to uh, progress on the path? I'm thinking of people who say have entered the Dharma and then find themselves in a, whatever the condition is, in a country now that is they're being oppressed, their religious choices are being oppressed, and maybe they can secretly practice, but they no longer have all the perfect causes and conditions, and
Mhm.
so it's saying there no. What does that mean?
Yeah, and I mean, that can happen. Again, that's one of the things that is kind of fickle about a perfect human rebirth, is that even us, even in our country, we can't be sure that that aspect of having access to the teachings will be there for the rest of our lives. We think it will. We're pretty sure. We're 80% sure. We're 90, but there could be all kinds of things could happen. We could be invaded. There could be a nuclear strike, and then there could be like martial law. We might start to go down an authoritarian kind of path, which maybe is kind of, to one degree, kind of happening in some circles. And then we might end up in a place that's very different than what we have. So it's hard to, it's certainly not the case that it's all, I don't think it's the case that we can say that it's absolutely all or nothing, that there's no gradations that are present in any of these, that all is lost if one of these isn't fully present, or that because even our health, we are going to experience a decline in our own health over time, and that's an obstacle. Um, so, but still, if when we do have all of, to broadly speaking, we do have the majority of our faculties, and we can, then if we really use that time very well, then we still have created really positive imprints um, during that time, then that we can rely on when maybe our memory is failing, and our our health isn't so good toward the end of our lives. So I don't think that that we can't say that that everything has to be up to 100%, and only when all 18 are at 100%, then there's any possibility of spiritual growth. And if there's any reduction in any of those, then that means that enlightenment is impossible, spiritual growth is totally blocked. We have to realize that there's a gradation, that that certainly there's a absolute ideal, but that probably in one way or another, in one or more of these 18 qualities, there maybe our whole lives will be characterized by less than 100%. But still, it's pretty, it's pretty close. It's good enough. It's we have it sufficiently. I mean, at least hopefully, because again, there's no guarantees that for the rest of our lives we will. We might find ourselves in a failed state, in a war zone, and then we really can't say. I mean, it's true that even in those really difficult conditions, spiritual, people can still practice. People can find ways of practicing, even in the most difficult circumstances. That's true. But this idea of perfect human rebirth is saying, what is the easiest route? What is the most conducive route? You don't want to be in a situation where you have to practice in a war zone, in a failed state, in a repressive regime. It's possible, but it's much more difficult. Um, so, like I said, I don't think it's black and white. It's not just a bifurcated state where, yes, these people are going to achieve enlightenment and these people are not. It's just to say, how do we make it as easy as possible by doing everything that we can to try to create the karmic causes and conditions to have all 18 of these qualities? Because that's the best chance that we have. That's the easiest, most reliable way to make progress, spiritual progress.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Nope. Okay. So then day 66, now we're getting into that section that I mentioned, where we're going to go through the other five states where consciousness can easily take rebirth at death, where our consciousness has taken rebirth and could take rebirth in the future. So the first of these, the quote is, "There is no way the hell being can do anything other than suffer." So this is one of the freedoms, not having been born in the hell realms. Um, so, and again, hell is an English word that we're stuck with. It's not, again, one of these things I'm not so fond of, because it comes with all of the Judeo-Christian baggage that we have in our culture. Um, the Tibetan word, I think it's Tibetan, Narok is the word that they use. I don't know, it might be Sanskrit. That's the word that they actually use. And the more literal translation is the unfree state, the state of being unfree. Um, Whereas, so I just kind of prefer to think of it as the Narok realm rather than the hell realm, because hell, it's like a place that you're sent to because you were bad, and it has all of the wrong kind of Judeo-Christian concepts, and it's so. But hell is the word that we are kind of stuck with from the translators from 100 years ago and up till now. It's the word that they use um, to talk about that realm. So, but it is true that of all of the realms, the most intense, overt physical and mental distress is occurring in that realm. And as we later on in the Lamrim, it becomes necessary to um, when you're looking at developing a sense of uh, concern about taking rebirth in the lower realms, um, still on the small scope, you really do meditate. There's very graphic descriptions in the Lamrim about the kinds of experiences that are going on in the hell realms. There's hot hells and cold hells and occasional hells. Um, so I won't make a joke about occasional hells. So yeah, so you have to meditate on what actually is happening there in order to really be motivated to not create the karmic causes of the hell realms, like killing and so on. But that comes still in the small scope, but later in the small scope, where it does become necessary to really think about that. But still, broadly speaking, we can say that it's a really intense, um, prolonged, kind of unending physical and mental distress that is the experience of the beings in that realm. And we can think about, for us, even when we just have a migraine, do we want to practice? Do we want to sit down with our Lamrim book, or do we want to meditate, even when it's just a migraine, which is absolutely nothing. It's not even, you can't in any way compare that experience to the kinds of experiences that are happening in the hell realms. So you can just see that it's deeply disadvantageous to be experiencing that, because there's absolutely no space in the mind for thinking about generosity or love or emptiness, or any of these, irrespective of like what kind of intellectual capacity. They don't really talk about, I mean, I haven't really seen a discussion about what kinds of minds those, like in the other realms they talk about, like in the animal realm and other, but I don't really know how intelligent or how, but the point is, it doesn't really matter, because they are oppressed with an incredible, unending, painful state. Um, and so there's just no room in the mind to engage in spiritual practice when that is what is happening. So he says, if we don't contemplate the suffering of the lower realms, we won't be able to see what a miracle this perfect human rebirth is, and will be very likely to squander it. Perhaps we can see that practicing Dharma is worthwhile, and that we might become a better person But somehow, without the impetus of understanding life in the lower realms, we will never have the energy to really take on the essence of the Dharma. That is why it is important to try to fully understand what each freedom means. So it's yeah, it's not a pleasant topic, the lower realms. But yeah, the Buddha would, it's the Buddha's experience. The Buddha remembers, and many sentient, many highly realized masters who came after the Buddha remember rebirth in the lower realms, remember that their mind left a particular form and entered a different form. And I don't know, it's interesting. My teacher at one point kind of said, well, maybe there are actual worlds, maybe it's not, because for us, like, I mean, some of it, when you read the description, some of it seems like those forms are sort of energetic in a way, because they talk, kind of like the upper realms, because they talk about how they can die in that in the hell realm, and then but the death isn't sufficient to that they just kind of reanimate in a way. They just sort of, which doesn't seem like something that we can that's part of our experience. We don't really see that happening. But but if we think about, like, Venus, or these, sort of like gas giant, you know the actual conditions, on that planet are kind of, there's intense heat, intense pressure. So it could be sort of like that, literally you're taking rebirth in a place where there are bodies that are um, accustomed, that are able to function in that kind of environment. um, and that's kind of how it is. um, I don't know, that was something that my teacher said at some point that I thought was interesting, that he actually, you know he mentioned that, or thought that maybe it worked kind of like that, at least maybe in some cases. um, and we can think, on earth, there's the vents, the lava vents on the ocean floor, and there's adapted sentient beings that live on those lava vents. So we can see that there are extreme conditions where life can still exist. Any thoughts or questions about the hell realm?
We want to know what your joke is.
Oh, I didn't really have one. I was just, because when they say occasional hell, they mean that it's like um, it's not like in the hells necessarily. It can be something that kind of comes and goes. It can, whether it's why they call it occasional. So I was going to be like, if you're stuck watching Fox News or something, that could be like an occasional hell. Like you can't change the channel. It's just all Fox News. Like that would be terrible. Something like that would be an example of an occasional hell. Um, you did ask.
I'm trying to work out where to put my hand up on this.
Oh no, go ahead.
We haven't met before, so thank you. I usually have Zooms with Venerable Rabina, and I got the New York time wrong. I find the schedule sometimes hard to follow. And then I saw that you were doing Lamrim, and it's always a good reminders, definitely. And I am thinking about this question that's, I guess, a bit of a theme that's been going on for me over the last year. I have a personal situation of course, getting older, as some people do, and I've had very severe health issues, and I have some understanding, I think, of karma not being linear in the way that a lot of Western interpretation of it can be, like, good karma, bad karma, that things arise at different times and can be related to different lifetimes and different manifestations. And so I take the attitude of that it's purification and making dedication and offering to that for other beings that may be suffering in these ways. But I think the deeper question that I'm really thinking that is in these times, because there is so much suffering in every level, which was predicted would happen, and harder to access teachings, etc., etc. I don't think I'm the only one who struggles with this, so I'm wondering what your thoughts are around how to. I have my own thoughts, but I'm interested in yours in terms of. So you can look at Ukraine, you can look at, or anywhere in the world, the flooding, the climate wars, post-traumatic stress disorder that every being just about seems to have. So there's this current sort of world karma that's happening that we're all present for. And I think I see a lot in a kind of a spiritual bypass that's happening for a lot of people, and in aversion to witnessing that suffering. And you just mentioned about sort of the hell realms, and that can be part of it. So that opening, having an open heart to hold that kind of suffering, to bear witness to it, so that you can be there by those people in some way, in whatever tangible action you can have, even if it's just like witnessing it and going, may these people be free from this suffering, all the way to actual whatever action you can bring. But that can become very, very also disturbing, to juggle that and hold that, and not have it then, for me, feel like it's creating anger or harm to myself. So I think I'm finding a balance with it, of a sort of non-violent, resistant sort of Martin Luther King kind of approach of like act anyway in the face of violence and keep bringing kindness to that. So I've talked a lot, but I think you're nodding, so I think you get where I'm coming from, and I'd be very interested in your thoughts. There's a lot in that, I know.
Yeah, I mean, so of course, in one way, all of that is the most advanced levels of practice. And of course, we're right now just, on the small scope where, the goal is, so I mean, those are really all great scope, practitioner issues. And of course, we should aspire to practice the great scope, and we should consider ourselves to be, as they say, we need to think about the small scope as the practices held in common with practitioners of the small scope, and not that I'm a small scope practitioner, but I'm engaging in the practices that are held in common with the small scope. And then I am engaging in practices held in common with the middle scope, because ultimately we want to think of ourselves as, truly aspiring to the great scope, and then hopefully mastering the great scope. And
yeah, it's a great point. Yeah.
So, but of course, like you're saying, so the aspect of that might be relevant is, maybe trying to take on too much or go too quickly, when we don't have the wisdom to really know what the right thing to do is, or to recognize
the right view. Yeah.
or to because we need to avoid using the view of karma to be hard-hearted. Of course, that's true. And we need to avoid using the view of emptiness to just sort of say, oh, well, it doesn't. But, it's also true that historically speaking, people achieved enlightenment, you know, mainly in their own room. They kind of, in the monasteries, the nunneries. It's also true that the causes and the conditions to achieve enlightenment were achievable with not a lot of interaction. They were interacting. They were interacting within their community, but they weren't, you know, traveling the world and trying to tamp down this and then travel here and tamp down that, and yet they still, because it's a mental, they develop the internal willingness to give away their body, the internal willingness to give away their possessions. They don't have to actually then do it. They don't have to, because if we talked a little bit before, and like if the perfection of generosity meant that there were no poor people, then no one would have ever achieved enlightenment, because in order to do it, they would have had to actually eliminate poverty, in the world, and they never did, and yet they can achieve enlightenment. So the other thing that we have to kind of be mindful of is how much time and effort I'm putting into trying to rearrange deck chairs on the Titanic, versus putting, energy and enthusiasm into the things that actually will result in enlightenment. Because because it's true that we do have the ability to help in various ways right now. That's true. But an enlightened being has infinitely more capacity to be of benefit. And so if we miss the opportunity to create those causes and conditions because we are, and like you're saying, there's also a danger of giving rise to hatred. There's a danger of, thinking, well, these are the good people and these are the bad people, and I have compassion for the good people and I don't like the bad people, which is a real obstacle to equanimity, to universal love and compassion. And that's going to take us away from that goal of enlightenment by getting really wrapped up in these worldly things. So there's a lot, there are pitfalls in all of that. So I would say that the balance is making sure that we are spending time on our practice, and creating the inner conditions to be able to respond skillfully, and then responding, and of course we have to also be willing to make mistakes. If you're not sure exactly if something is actually just happening in your immediate experience, you don't say, well, I'm not 100% sure what the right thing to do is, and so therefore I won't do anything. You still, you do the best that you can in that situation to try to help with whatever wisdom, whatever compassion, whatever love that you have developed. But so the balance is, am I spending enough time and putting enough effort into truly deepening love, compassion, and wisdom so that my actions are naturally well informed by what's genuinely happening in the mind? So
That's good. So yeah, it's along the lines that I think, and you just made me remember Donza Khyentse Rinpoche. Once I had a question one time some years back, and he said to me, that's a good intention because you should have doubt to some extent in the view So that's a good reminder. And I think for my situation, because my life's changed so radically from being very active and always an activist and, an associate professor and working and helping people, to really being like I'm in a monastery because I'm in my home all the time and mostly alone. And so that's a big transition as well, to a softer place of practice of holding it inside. And the value of the teachings has never been clearer to me. So it's a pathway, if you take it that way. So yeah, thank you for addressing it. I think it's something that is really needed. This kind of discussion is really needed in general in the world. And I'm sharing sort of one-on-one, but hopefully it's useful for other people for this kind of discussion. And thinking also many years ago with the Dalai Lama, I had the privilege to ask a question, and the question was like, besides any kind of faith or practice or belief that a human being has in whatever country, gender, beyond that, what would be the one thing that would make a difference? And I'll never forget it because it was so crystal clear. And it was that if people could treat everyone as if they were the most beloved member of their family, and that's that, like, everyone's been our mother in a previous life. But that was just so, and it's such a message that we need now. Yeah. And difficult. Thank you for that. That's given me some good thoughts for today. Thank you everyone else for being patient and listening to all of that.
So we're just out of time for
I took it all,
today.
sorry.
So we will we'll pick it back up. Things get slightly better. We're like into the hungry ghost realm, which is a little bit better than the hell realm when we pick it back up. But yeah, so we're still going to be going through the lower realms and then even the upper realm and looking at why it's good that we're not experiencing those realms. But so we'll dedicate. So recollect your altruistic motivation and think that by listening and participating, you've actualized that motivation, which has created positive energy in the mind. And just have a sense of offering that energy, visualizing it ripening in really vast, profound, beneficial ways. And just do that in whatever way is valid for you. All right. So we'll meet again on Monday and continue. Thanks for coming.